Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Old West. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1884, 3 winters after the gunfight at the OK Corral, an event that still echoed through the dry winds of Cochise County, Arizona Territory. The papers had printed every rumor they could about the Earps and the Clantons, then moved on, leaving behind the dust and the bodies. But in the quiet that followed, strange whispers began to surface about the surviving members of the Clanton family, what they carried, where they went, and what they may have done in the shadows once the crowds dispersed. A letter found in the archives of the Tombstone Epitaph in 1907, written by an unnamed deputy, mentioned a small property near Dragoon Springs, purchased under an alias, A. Collins, believed by locals to be Ike Clanton himself. The letter describes a cabin, too quiet for a cattleman, too secret for a farmer, and reports of smoke at odd hours and shallow pits behind the barn. Travelers passing through remembered the uneasy silence of the place. One merchant, Josiah Wren, claimed in a later affidavit that he delivered supplies there only once. He described the men on the property as pale, watchful, and in poor company, and noted that the youngest, perhaps a cousin or a hired hand, refused to speak, only nodding with wide, frightened eyes. For years, the area was thought abandoned. Then, in 1891, a pair of prospectors, Charles Dittmer and a man known only as French Tom, reported finding bones not of cattle, buried shallow and in haste. Their statement, recorded in the Benson County Record, went largely ignored, dismissed as the talk of drifters. But among the yellowed files in the county courthouse lies a second page that never made print, a rough sketch of the graves, marked only with initials. When a local preacher, Reverend Amos Lyle, rode out to bless the site, he described a dread over the ground, like the earth itself wished to close again. His journal, later found in an attic trunk, mentioned a symbol burned into one of the cabin beams, an inverted horseshoe, a sign some ranchers used to ward off bad luck, though others saw it as a mockery of faith. These fragments, the letter, the affidavit, the graves, were scattered across years and counties. Yet together, they draw the outline of something larger than mere outlawry. The name Clanton had already been printed in blood and gunpowder, but what remained after the headlines were gone was something different, quieter, colder, and deliberately buried. And so this file begins, with the whispers around Dragoon Springs, where the last traces of the Clanton name refused to die, and the land itself seemed unwilling to speak of what it had seen. The Clanton name had long carried a peculiar weight across Arizona Territory. In saloons and sheriff offices alike, it was spoken either with bitterness or pity, depending on who was doing the remembering. By 1885, most believed the family line had fractured after the gunfight in Tombstone, some dead, others vanished, and the rest rumored to have fled toward New Mexico or deeper into the borderlands. But in the ledgers of the Pima County Tax Office, one finds faint evidence that an A. Collins, later believed to be Ike Clanton, paid a modest property fee for a tract of land outside Wilcox, close to the Stagecoach Trail. The handwriting on the receipt, still preserved, is oddly shaky, as if written by someone unused to writing their own name. The property itself was never prosperous. Locals described it as a broken ranch, a narrow strip of land with a cabin that leaned too far west, a windmill that never turned right, and a small stable that smelled of kerosene instead of hay. The only steady visitors were 2 men known as Henry and Elijah Burns, cousins from the Texas line who claimed to be debt men, collectors working for a cattle outfit that existed only on paper. It was around this time that the Arizona Weekly Citizen ran a brief, almost forgettable notice. Mysterious disappearance of a surveyor near the Dragoon Range, tools found abandoned, no body recovered. No one connected it to the Clantons, not then. But later testimony from an itinerant preacher, Samuel Hodge, recalled stopping at the ranch for water and seeing a length of cloth laid over something in the barn that no one would speak of. Neighbors, if they could be called that, told odd stories too. Mrs. Lydia Crouch, who lived 4 miles south, wrote to her sister in Florence describing the nights. You could hear hammering long past midnight, and then nothing but the coyotes. My husband said it was fence work, but who builds fences at that hour? A few months later, the same letter mentioned something more chilling. 2 riders came to our door at dusk, asked if we'd seen a drifter named Crenshaw. When we said no, one smiled and said, "He'll turn up where the sun can't find him." Then they both laughed, but the sound didn't match their eyes. By 1886, the ranch had developed a quiet reputation. Stage drivers refused to stop near its turnoff. Cowhands cut wide around the property even in daylight. Yet no formal complaint was ever filed. Law in those territories was thin, and unless someone of importance went missing, there was little appetite to stir old names that carried gunpowder in their shadow. The first real attempt at inquiry came from a newly assigned constable, William T. Granger, whose records, what remains of them, speak of the Clanton tract and unearthed disturbances behind the shed. His notes end abruptly after May of that year. No official explanation was filed, only a terse remark in the county clerk's margin. Constable Granger not heard from again. And so the ground near Wilcox began to hold its silence more tightly than ever. By the spring of 1887, the region around Wilcox had grown uneasy. The ranch known locally as the Collins Place still stood, its windows black with dust, and yet faint lamplight was seen there at odd hours, just enough for travelers to whisper that someone was still living among the ruins. An entry dated March 10, 1887, in the Cochise County Sheriff's Log, records the statement of a freight driver named Otto Kellerman. He had been hauling supplies toward Fort Bowie when he spotted 2 figures dragging what looked like a sack or body across the dry creek bed. When he called out, they vanished into the mesquite. Kellerman's report ends with the phrase, "They moved wrong, like they had no weight." The sheriff dismissed it as a drunken fancy. Still, Kellerman wasn't the only one unsettled. A former ranch hand, Benjamin Rowe, filed an affidavit months later claiming he had worked at the property briefly under Mr. Collins. He described digging pits for refuse and feed storage, though when asked to elaborate, he added, "The smell was wrong for feed, and I was told not to look once the earth was turned." One of the few official records connecting the site to the broader history of the territory comes from a deputy named Clifford L. Hart, who mentioned the property in relation to the gunfight at the OK Corral, saying, "After the smoke cleared in Tombstone, the Clanton boys who survived were never the same. Some said they buried their honor with their kin. Others said they kept digging." That single line appeared in Hart's unpublished memoir, later archived at the University of Arizona in 1913. Historians rarely cite it, dismissing it as anecdotal. Yet for those reconstructing the case file, it's the first time an officer directly tied the old gunfight's aftermath to later disappearances. The following year, a young schoolteacher named Helen Dorsey began collecting oral histories for a local paper. She visited the Dragoon area and spoke to surviving settlers, among them Mrs. Crouch, now widowed. The woman's recollection was unsteady, but one phrase stood out. They never left. They just changed faces. Dorsey's notebook was later recovered from her estate, water-damaged and incomplete. Among the legible lines was a sketch of a burned cabin, captioned only, "Site near Old Clanton Claim." Meanwhile, the land records grew stranger. A transfer deed from 1888 lists a new owner, Elias Brand, age and origin unknown, paying in silver dollars and livestock, witnessed by the same notary who had once filed the Collins papers. No one ever found Brand's signature again, and within a year, tax payments ceased. By 1890, local authorities declared the land abandoned, but prospectors passing through still found boot tracks fresh in the dust and horses tied with worn tack near the dry well. When one prospector, Levi Jackson, peered into that well, he swore he saw a lantern flicker far below, though no man could have stood there. The records stop again, abruptly, as if the clerks themselves decided the file should remain unfinished. But among the private correspondence of one clerk, Matthew J. Hines, appears a chilling note written in pencil. Not all the Clantons died in Tombstone. Some simply buried the truth deeper. In the summer of 1891, a thunderstorm rolled over the Dragoon foothills, flooding low ground and exposing what the earth had been keeping. A rancher named Caleb Miles came across the site the next morning while checking for stray cattle. What he found, according to his later affidavit, was a section of earth sunk inward, with boards showing through and a stench like spoiled meat. Sheriff's deputies from Benson were dispatched reluctantly. The area's reputation preceded it, and the men took to calling it the cursed section long before they arrived. Their report, filed under the name Deputy A.V. Crane, is preserved in poor condition, half of the ink washed by water, but still legible enough to read the following line. Unearthed 3 distinct remains, partial, consistent with adult male. Evidence of bindings at wrist. Clothing remnants indicate working men, not military issue. Crane's notes also mention a single object found in the collapsed ground, a brass locket, unmarked except for the faint engraving of a horseshoe inverted. He logged it under unclaimed. No one ever retrieved it. After the discovery, word traveled fast through the neighboring towns. The old Clanton name resurfaced like a ghost. Many had thought Ike had been shot in a gunfight with lawmen years earlier near Springerville, but some swore that wasn't true, that a body had been identified too quickly, the face obscured by decay. One aging bartender, Patrick Holton, told a reporter from the Tombstone Epitaph, "They wanted to say it was over, but you can't bury trouble that easy." When Reverend Amos Lyle, now a frail man, heard of the find, he rode out again. His second journal entry, dated August 1891, is the last in his hand. I stood over the earth as the clouds passed. I felt certain I'd blessed this ground before, yet it felt untouched. The smell of rain and iron together made me tremble. I spoke the words, but the silence that followed was not of peace. It was waiting. Shortly after, the Reverend's horse returned to town without him. The search party that went looking found only his torn Bible, half buried in mud near the same hollow. A single page was visible, the verse describing Cain's exile. Within weeks, a federal agent, Marshal Henry Pike, arrived from Tucson to investigate. His report was clinical but thin, suggesting criminal concealment of deaths between 1885 to 1887, possibly retaliatory in nature. He dismissed local superstition, attributing the inverted horseshoes and nocturnal lights to backcountry ritual or intimidation tactics. Still, the report ends with a line that stands apart in tone. The surviving Clanton men were known to travel in pairs, to take shelter underground during storms, and to carry the same rifles found at the Dragoon property. I recommend no further inquiry. Too many years lost, and too few witnesses left to answer. And with that, the official record closed once again, leaving behind the scent of wet soil and unfinished prayers. But the rains didn't stop that season, and each storm revealed a little more of what the desert had chosen to keep hidden. When the reports from Deputy Crane and Marshal Pike reached Tucson, the territorial authorities debated reopening the old Clanton file. It was not enthusiasm that moved them, but embarrassment. Too many unanswered cases in the Dragoon region. Too many travelers vanished without formal pursuit. By late 1892, the governor's office ordered a limited manhunt to locate Elias Brand, the false name believed tied to the Clantons' remaining kin. The search was led by Deputy Marshal Jeb Collier, a quiet man from Prescott known for his methodical record-keeping. His journal, found decades later among unclaimed estate papers, outlines his movements across the desert in the terse language of the trade. Tracked suspect west of Wilcox. Cabin burned. Footprints head north. Discovered shallow grave. Animal bones only. Locals uncooperative. Claim area cursed. Collier pressed on toward Pinal County, where an innkeeper described 2 men matching Brand's description who had paid in silver coins stamped 1878. Too bright for their age, the innkeeper noted. They stayed one night, left before dawn, and never returned. Meanwhile, back in Cochise County, another deputy, Robert Dunning, collected testimony from a Mexican laborer named Esteban Cruz, who claimed to have seen the same 2 men camped by an arroyo near Dragoon Wash. Cruz described hearing them argue, one insisting they leave the earth alone, the other demanding they finish what was started. The laborer hid until sunrise and found the site deserted, except for a small pile of animal bones wrapped in canvas. By autumn, the manhunt had thinned. The files show a growing fatigue among officials. Some wrote plainly that the Clanton matter was ghost-chasing, yet Collier refused to abandon it. His last known dispatch, dated November 1892, reads, "Found abandoned horse bearing Old Brand C. Hoof worn to split. Trail leads into C. Anion west of San Pedro. Smell of smoke near rocks. Continuing on foot." He was never heard from again. His satchel was recovered by chance 5 years later by a mining crew buried beneath stones with the pages still legible, though one line had been smudged into a single streak of ink across the leather. The mining foreman, Lewis Port, wrote in his statement, "We left it where we found it. No man in his right mind stays there after sundown." Folklore began to overtake fact. Children in nearby settlements whispered of the Twins of Dragoon, figures said to roam the arroyos during storms, carrying lanterns that flickered blue instead of yellow. Superstition, perhaps, but every few years a traveler would report seeing lights moving in rhythm, as if guided by purpose, vanishing when approached. By 1895, the Clanton name had slipped fully into legend. Officially, the Dragoon site was marked condemned and unstable. Unofficially, it became a place no one wanted to name aloud. Yet the records of the gunfight at the OK Corral remained in the archives of Tombstone, reminding anyone who bothered to look that the Clantons were not just phantoms. They were men who had once breathed, fought, and buried things both living and dead in the soil of Arizona. By 1897, the Dragoon property was a name whispered rather than spoken. The few travelers who passed through avoided the creek bed entirely, claiming that the air grew still there even on windy days. A tinker named Emmanuel Shaw, who mended pots along the Wilcox Trail, recorded in his notebook that no bird lands near the Clanton ground, not one, as if they know something the rest of us pretend not to. The county clerk's office in Benson attempted to compile surviving evidence for territorial review that year, but tragedy, or perhaps coincidence, struck again. In March of 1898, a fire tore through the records building, consuming 2 decades of criminal reports, affidavits, and deeds. The blaze was blamed on faulty lantern oil, though the night watchman insisted he had seen a man standing inside the vault minutes before the smoke began, wearing a long coat and a brim pulled low. His statement was never formally taken. By morning, he had disappeared. A single ledger from the office survived, its edges scorched but legible enough to show 4 entries listed under aliases: A. Collins, E. Brand, H. Burns, and L. Carter, all connected by the same notary and within 3 years of each other. Each file bore a faint C in the margin, inked in a hand later identified as that of the notary himself, Elias Dorn. Dorn fled the territory shortly after the fire and was later rumored to have surfaced in El Paso under another name. That same summer, the Arizona Daily Star published a peculiar article titled "Whispers in the Hills, the Clanton Curse." It recounted tales of men losing their way near Dragoon Springs, of wagons turning in circles on level ground, of a prospector's mule found days later with its hooves worn bloody, as if it had walked in place. The piece quoted an unnamed academic from Tucson who speculated that the psychological shadow of the OK Corral had tainted the area, a direct callback to those events 16 years prior. But for some, the pattern was too precise to ignore. Among them was Professor Alistair Keene, a lecturer from the fledgling Arizona Normal School, who in 1899 began a private study of missing persons around Cochise County. His letters, stored in the school's archive, show a gradual obsession. These are not isolated vanishings. Each corresponds with a reported sighting of men answering to Clanton description, aged but not aged enough. Keene's notes end abruptly in 1900, the last entry marked by a shaky hand. The graves are moving. When a janitor found his office empty weeks later, only the smell of gun oil and damp soil remained. Meanwhile, townsfolk turned to folklore to make sense of what officials could not. Children were told that during storms, if they saw twin lights in the distance, They were to stay silent until the thunder passed. A woman in Tombstone claimed her husband's boots were found near the Dragoon site, lined with sand that glowed faintly in moonlight. No one investigated further. The Clanton land, by then, had swallowed its name whole. At the turn of the century, as the frontier faded into history and Arizona edged toward statehood, a few scholars began taking renewed interest in the half-buried legends of the territory. One such man, Dr. Edwin L. Mercer, a historian from San Francisco, came to Tucson in 1901 to gather accounts for his forthcoming study on post-war outlaw families. Among his sources, he noted a recurring theme. The Clanton shadow persists in every county record, even where their names are struck through. Mercer traveled to Wilcox that autumn and met with an aging constable named Jonathan Beale, who had served briefly under Sheriff Johnny Behan in the years following the gunfight at the OK Corral. Beale, then nearly blind, recounted to Mercer the state of the land he'd once patrolled. It weren't lawless anymore. It was empty, like something had taken the fight out of the earth itself. I rode past that Collins place once after a storm. The ground looked like it had been tilled, but nothing ever grew there. Not a weed, not a thorn. Mercer's notes describe his own journey to the Dragoon property in early winter. He found only scattered boards, a collapsed windmill, and a dry well lined with rusted chain. Yet, among the debris, he recovered what he called pages from an unbound ledger, wrapped in oilcloth and half-rotted. The handwriting matched no record on file, but bore a series of initials, CB and H, alongside lists of cattle brands, numbers, and odd notations such as payment complete and earth reclaimed. In his later correspondence, Mercer expressed deep unease. The markings are neither ordinary ranch records nor mere bookkeeping. The tone suggests ritual. I hesitate to publish for fear of sensationalism, yet I cannot ignore that these men believed themselves caretakers of something more than land. His manuscript, titled The Vanishing of the Clanton Line, was now ever printed. The publisher's office burned in 1903, destroying the galley proofs. Mercer himself returned to California and withdrew from teaching altogether. However, one of his students, Clara Addison, preserved fragments of his lecture notes. In them, Mercer refers to a box of earth sent to him anonymously after his return, a sample from the Dragoon site that, when opened, released an odor like wet iron and lightning. The sample was reportedly lost when his home was sold years later. Around this same time, other testimonies began to surface again. A railway surveyor, Nathan Probst, recorded in his log that workers laying new track near the Dragoon foothills uncovered old timbers and glass bottles buried in geometric shapes. He reported the find to local officials, but was told to leave them lie, it's Clanton ground. Even as the 20th century began, the name still held weight. The folklore of curses and unfinished burials now intertwined with the documented violence of the OK Corral, binding history and myth until no one could tell one from the other. And in that confusion, the old family seemed to live on, not in flesh, but in the record's quiet omissions. In 1904, a mining concern called the Sonora Prospecting Company purchased parcels around the old Dragoon Springs route, unaware that one corner of their claim overlapped what locals still called Clanton ground. The company's goal was copper, not legend, but superstition has a way of surviving on paper. The foreman, Harold "Red" Tully, noted in his field journal that half the workers refused to dig within 100 yards of the dry creek bed. 2 months later, when excavation finally began, the company unearthed what newspapers would cautiously refer to as human material. The Arizona Republican printed a short column, fragments of several skeletons discovered near the old Dragoon Trail. Authorities believed them to predate settlement. But Tully's private report, sent to his investors, was more explicit. He described remains interred with intent, bound with wire, and buried facing downward. One skull bore a bullet entry that had healed before death, suggesting survival of an earlier wound. Tully turned over the evidence to the county coroner, Dr. Franklin Sorrell, who examined the remains and concluded they were of adult males, Anglo, deceased 20 to 25 years. The timeline aligned uncomfortably with the Clanton disappearances. Sorrell's assistant later recalled that the doctor grew pale at the sight of one femur carved with the letter I. Officials were slow to respond, reluctant to disturb a history already steeped in violence. Still, word reached the tombstone epitaph, which in a rare act of restraint wrote, "If the earth has given back what the Clantons took from it, then justice has its own calendar." Shortly after the report circulated, Tully and 2 laborers vanished from their camp. Their tools remained, arranged neatly beside the open pit. The company abandoned operations within the month, filing for insolvency soon after. In a margin note found years late, in the office ledgers, someone had written in faded ink, "Do not return, ground breathes." Around this same time, a group of amateur historians from Tucson, led by Professor Amos Brecht, visited the Dragoon area to investigate the mining claims. They brought with them early photographic plates, one of which, now cracked and nearly blackened, shows the faint outline of the creek bed, the collapsed cabin, and what appears to be a low mound behind it. Brecht labeled the photo simply, "Site of the Clanton Retributions." In his field notes, Brecht references the gunfight at the OK Corral as the public death of the family, and the Dragoon site as its private resurrection. His tone is cautious, but one line betrays genuine fear. There is a quality to this silence that suggests observation. Even the wind seems to hesitate. The following spring, Brecht left Arizona for Denver and never published his findings. His students said he refused to speak of the expedition again. By 1906, local maps began marking the area not as farmland or prospecting ground, but as unsurveyable terrain. The precise reason was never given, though one surviving draft from the Arizona Territorial Survey Office contains a penciled warning beside the coordinates, "Mark void, no measurements hold." By 1907, the Dragoon site had again fallen silent, its latest disturbance buried under bureaucratic disinterest. Yet the men who had touched its soil rarely stayed quiet for long. Letters began surfacing, unsigned, written in an identical slanting hand, sent to post offices across Arizona territory. Each bore the same closing line, "The debt isn't done." One of these letters reached Sheriff Thomas Baird of Benson. He believed it a prank until he received a second, sealed in dust-stained parchment with a crude drawing of an inverted horseshoe pressed in red wax. Baird logged it, then reportedly told a colleague, "If those Clantons are ghosts, they've learned how to use a pen." A month later, the Tucson Historical Society reported that several documents donated by Dr. Mercer's estate, including his field sketches from the Dragoon expedition, had vanished from their archive. The theft left no sign of forced entry. A janitor named Elroy Nash, questioned afterward, insisted he had seen 2 men by lamplight arguing softly, one calling the other Ike. He was dismissed the next day for drunkenness. Across the border in Lordsburg, New Mexico, a cattle buyer named Martin Bodine filed a notarized statement describing 2 strangers who sold him rusted Winchester rifles for scrap. On one stock, he claimed, was carved a faint horseshoe, inverted. When he read later of the Clanton connection, he burned the weapons behind his barn. "Didn't want the past following me home," he told a reporter. Meanwhile, the few officials who attempted to organize the Dragoon evidence found their notes missing, misfiled, or mysteriously destroyed. Deputy Robert Dunning's earlier affidavits disappeared altogether from the county registry, replaced by empty folder tabs marked "Withdrawn." When queried, the clerk responsible, Celia Rowe, could only shrug. "Some papers decide not to stay," she said. T was around this period that whispers of sightings began again. A shepherd near Cienega Creek swore that during a lightning storm he saw 2 riders pass through the rain without getting wet. A mail carrier weeks later described hearing voices along the same trail, men arguing in old-time accents as if the year hadn't changed. Folklore flared anew. In Tombstone's taverns, old men told of the 2 that dug, said to rise during thunder and disappear when silence returned. To the younger generation, it was a story for tourists. But among the elders, those who remembered the gunfight at the OK Corral, it was something else, a warning. Even Reverend Lyle's Bible, long thought lost, reappeared in 1908 when the widow of a ranch hand brought it to the church at Bisbee. Inside, she claimed, was a folded scrap written in a familiar hand. Dragoon never sleeps. The name must be kept. The handwriting matched known samples of Ike Clanton's from the 1880s. No one could prove it, of course, but after that, even the sheriff stopped speaking of reopening the case. The desert has a way of convincing men to leave old stories buried. By 1909, the newly established Arizona Territorial Survey commissioned a geological study across Cochise County, intending to chart water sources for a proposed rail expansion. Among the assigned crew was surveyor Henry A. Cobble, a methodical man who kept a meticulous diary, one that would, years later, become a key piece in the Clanton case's strange epilogue. Cobble and his team reached the Dragoon area in mid-May, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, about its reputation. His first entries mention only the punishing heat, the difficulty of measuring stable ground, and the odd behavior of compasses that spun a degree or two off every hour. Then, on May 14th, the tone shifts. At dusk, we found the remains of an old structure, logs burned black, ground unsettled. Mr. Laird reported a strong odor, metallic, though no storm. Dug shallow trench to set markers, uncovered boards, and iron chain. The next day's entry is shorter. Refused to camp on site. Something moves under. Wind silent. Weeks later, the official survey log submitted to Tucson included no mention of the incident. But when Cobble's private diary resurfaced in 1921, a later page bore a chilling addition written in pencil, dated after the survey had supposedly concluded. Found one intact grave east of creek. Marker carved BC, rest face down, not animal, not time-worn, shovel marks recent. County records confirm no new burials were authorized in that district after 1887. Whoever dug that grave had done so decades after the last documented inhabitant. During the same season, the tombstone epitaph ran a small feature titled "Old Ground Gives Up Its Ghosts," referencing an unnamed survey team unnerved by discovery of human remains at a forbidden site. The editor received an anonymous letter days later, urging him not to print a follow-up. He complied. By late 1909, local archives show one last legal transaction connected to the property, a transfer of mineral rights to Samuel Crane, believed to be a relative of the deputy who'd filed the original 1891 report. The sale was never completed. Crane disappeared en route to Wilcox, his wagon found overturned by the roadside with all papers missing, but his compass left spinning in the dust. A Tucson librarian, Margaret Delane, later catalogued a parcel delivered anonymously to her office in 1910. Inside were 3 water-stained maps and a note. Do not correct what was already measured wrong. The handwriting was faintly familiar to Delane. She swore it resembled the samples she'd seen attributed to Dr. Mercer. Scholars who reviewed the materials decades later noted one eerie detail. The ink used to trace the Dragoon region on the maps was darker than the rest, as though freshly drawn. Yet tests confirmed the documents predated the 20th century. By the time the survey closed, the official report listed the Dragoon parcel as geologically unstable, unfit for construction. No further investigation followed. The area was quietly omitted from maps in the years leading to statehood. But one footnote in Cobble's journal, rarely quoted, captures what the report did not. I do not think the land is empty. I think it remembers. The years between 1910 and 1915 passed without official mention of the Dragoon property, as if the earth itself had swallowed both evidence and curiosity. Arizona moved toward statehood. Rail lines stretched north, and the frontier that had once defined lawlessness gave way to bureaucratic quiet. Yet, in the margins of small-town papers, the old name surfaced now and then, usually as rumor or cautionary tale. In 1911, a brief notice in the Bisbee Daily Review mentioned unidentified remains discovered near Dragoon Springs, believed to be of pioneer origin. No follow-up appeared. But private letters in the possession of Father Dorian Caffey, a Jesuit missionary traveling through the region, tell another story. He wrote to his superior in El Paso, "I visited the so-called Clanton lands at dusk. Though nothing visible remained of habitation, the air was heavy and sweet, as if decay still breathed. I thought I heard prayer in a low voice near the dry well, but there was no one there." Father Caffey's letters stopped that same year. His last entry, unsigned, reads simply, "Forgive them, for they remember what they buried." A few locals still living near Wilcox continued to speak of strange visitors, 2 men on horseback, seen during lightning storms. A farmer, Daniel Proctor, described them as thin as fence wire, faces pale as ash, carrying lanterns that made no heat. The sheriff laughed off the tale, but within months, Proctor sold his property and left the territory entirely. By 1912, a young journalist named Nora Beecham from the Arizona Republican began collecting oral histories of the fading frontier. She was advised to avoid Dragoon Springs, but curiosity led her there one February afternoon. Her notes, found in a chest decades later, recount an encounter with an old man who identified himself as Harrison Burns, the same surname that had appeared in the tax lead. Gers linked to the Clanton aliases 30 years prior. Beecham recorded his words phonetically, the way she heard them. "They ain't gone, miss. They went down, not away. Some debts get paid in the dark." She asked him what he meant. He only smiled, his eyes watering from the wind, and said, "You tell your folks to leave the ground be. It don't want remembering." When Beecham returned to Tucson to file her report, she fell ill with fever and never completed the article. Her surviving pages end mid-sentence. "The earth here feels hollow, as though waiting to speak." Around the same time, a minor earthquake struck the region, barely a tremor by geological measure, yet enough to unearth small fragments of timber and rusted tools near the old property line. One of the surveyors sent to inspect the site, Harold Cobble, the son of the original surveyor, noted in his field report that the ground yields easily, as if recently turned despite no evidence of weathering. After that, the Dragoon file was closed for good. The last clerical note, penned in fading violet ink, reads, "Case considered settled by natural decay." But for those who had been there, the priests, the farmers, the surveyors, the memory lingered like a rumor of unfinished prayers. By 1913, the Dragoon country was little more than a ghost stretch of rock and wind, visited only by the desperate or the lost. Yet as Arizona took its place among the states, an odd revival of interest emerged, not from lawmen or miners this time, but from storytellers. Traveling shows and dime novelists began weaving the Clanton name into fiction, blending truth and terror until even locals forgot where the facts ended. A serialized pamphlet titled "The Cursed Outlaws of Cochise County" began circulation that year in mining towns. Its author, signing only as ELM, was presumed to be Dr. Edwin Mercer, the same historian who had vanished from academia a decade earlier. The pamphlet's language was curiously restrained, more report than drama. It spoke of a family debt unpaid beneath the Dragoon dust, and of lanterns burning in hollows unseen. Those who read it claimed it felt less written than transcribed, as if copied from a source too old to name. Around the same time, a group of soldiers stationed near Fort Huachuca reported finding the remnants of a homestead while surveying trails. Their lieutenant, Charles Givens, filed a short note to headquarters describing uneven ground, like graves disturbed, and markings of a horseshoe carved into the bark of dead mesquite. No follow-up inspection was ordered, but folklore, once rekindled, spreads faster than wildfire. Within months, the phrase "Clanton Hollow" entered popular speech across the region, used by ranchers to describe any place where tools broke or animals refused to cross. Children dared each other to whisper the name into dry wells, believing a voice would answer back. In 1914, a university lecturer named Professor William Dade attempted to separate fact from myth by revisiting official archives. He noted how many pages between 1885 and 1891 were missing, water-damaged, or replaced by unrelated receipts. Pets, Dade's surviving notes, include a sketch of the Dragoon area, annotated with cryptic phrases, "sound beneath shale," "burn marks circular," and ledger fragments confirm 3 beyond Ike. His colleagues later claimed he destroyed his own drafts, muttering that some stories finish themselves if you let them. That same winter, a letter arrived at the offices of the Tombstone Epitaph, unsigned but bearing a single wax seal in the shape of a reversed horseshoe. Inside, it read only, "The ground is not done remembering. Let it rest." The editor, old and nearly blind, reportedly burned the letter unread after those first lines. When storms swept through the Dragoon Range later that year, travelers claimed the thunder rolled differently, hollow, like voices caught inside a canyon. A ranch hand riding near the foothills said he saw lights weaving through the dark, like men walking lanterns across the stars. No one pursued it. Not anymore. The war in Europe had begun, and the Old West seemed far behind. But in that remote stretch of Arizona, where the wind still carried the dry whisper of unfinished reckonings, the name Clanton was not forgotten. It simply waited, just beneath the sand. The winter of 1915 brought torrential rain to southern Arizona, the kind not seen in decades. Riverbeds filled, roads vanished under sheets of clay, and even the old mining shafts around Dragoon Springs collapsed under the weight of water. When the storm passed, the desert seemed reborn, washed clean, except for one place. Traveling along the old coach route, Deputy Marshal Stephen Harlow discovered something protruding from the freshly torn hillside, the corner of a wooden crate, half-rotted, packed with stones to keep it buried. Inside were rusted bits of metal, paper fragments sealed in wax, and a strip of faded cloth embroidered with the initials I.C. Harlow turned the items over to the county office, unaware of their significance. The clerk, however, recognized the initials immediately. He wrote in his logbook, "Likely personal effect of Isaac Clanton, to be held for reference." The next day, the crate was gone. No theft was reported. No record remains of where it went. In the months that followed, similar finds emerged, small things, seemingly random, a spur engraved backward, a pistol grip carved with twin horseshoes, and a tattered journal with only 2 legible lines. "They will not let us lie. The debt keeps the ground awake." That journal was traced to Henry Burns, the cousin often associated with the Collins alias, though no living witness ever confirmed it. The handwriting, according to one archivist, looked as if written underwater. As word spread of the flood's aftermath, a few curious souls returned to the site: reporters, relic hunters, and one university assistant named Sarah Dade, daughter of Professor William Dade. Her field notes, preserved at the Arizona Historical Society, are perhaps the last written account from someone who actually set foot on the Clanton property. She describes the terrain in unsettling detail. Soil still moist thou, weeks dry. Ground uneven, as if breathes. Found old well collapsed inward. Heard sound like faint metal striking stone, though no wind. Sarah left the site before sundown. Her final note, penned that same evening, reads, "The quiet follows you home." Around that same period, townsfolk began reporting tremors again, though the weather was calm. Wells overflowed, and strange lights appeared across the range, blue-white flares seen only at night, vanishing when approached. One miner claimed to have followed the glow to an open pit, where he found a length of chain and a child's toy horse buried in sand. When he told his foreman, the man only said, "You've been near Clanton ground. Best forget the way back." Within a year the rain stopped and the roads dried, but the folklore deepened. People said the flood had woken something, that it washed away what time had covered. A preacher in Benson even declared during Sunday service, "The wages of blood don't drown, they rise." The county officials quietly ordered the Dragoon section marked off as unstable land, and by 1916 it disappeared from newly printed maps once again. But locals still swore that after heavy rain, if you walked near the old coach road, you could hear the sound of shovels in the distance, digging, stopping, and digging again. By 1917, whispers of the lantern lights returned. Freight drivers traveling between Tombstone and Wilcox reported seeing twin glows floating above the low plains after dusk. Always 2, never 1, moving in slow, deliberate arcs. Some claimed the lights appeared to follow them for miles, keeping pace until they reached open ground. Others said the glow came from below, as though shining through thin layers of earth. Newspapers avoided printing these tales. The Great War in Europe dominated every column. Yet among Arizona's interior communities, old fears found new life. An elderly blacksmith in Fairbank, Mr. Enoch Fry, insisted the lights were the Clantons still walking dead, and that they carry their own graves with them. His statement was dismissed until a reporter from the Tucson Citizen, Louis Hargrave, decided to see the place for himself. Hargrave's surviving field notes, 3 pages smudged with rain, record his arrival near the Dragoon foothills on June 3, 1917. The land smells like iron. I hear hammering, though no thunder. Saw 2 glows near the ridge at 9:47 p.m. Thought them miners' lamps till they passed through mesquite without shadow. My horse refused to move. Hargrave's notebook was found days later on a wagon seat in Benson. His body was never recovered. The renewed attention prompted the Arizona Historical Society to request the old Clanton files for review. When the clerk opened the archive drawers, the folders were missing, every one relating to Dragoon Springs, the Collins alias, and the 1891 investigation. The index cards remained, but each had been stamped "Withdrawn by authority." No signature or date. Archivist Eleanor Van Ralt, who first reported the loss, described hearing footsteps in the record hall the night before the disappearance. She swore the smell of wet earth filled the air. Her written complaint, though formally log, Jed, vanished soon after. Meanwhile, Surveyor Harold Cobble, now nearing 50, returned once more to confirm land stability for a new telegraph route. His final report, found decades later among private effects, included an unnerving sketch, 2 shadowed figures standing over a mound, one holding a lantern, the other a shovel. The caption beneath reads, "Seen during storm, same place as Father's mark." When asked why the telegraph lines never extended through that corridor, engineers claimed unreliable ground conductivity. Unofficially, workers refused to dig. By autumn, the twin lights appeared less frequently, as if the storms themselves carried them away. Yet the legend persisted, spoken in taverns, murmured in churchyards, and half believed even by the skeptical. A local saying emerged around that time: "If the night glows blue, turn your horse west, and don't look back." The last known mention of the Dragoon site before statehood came in 1918, from a weather observer near Benson Station. His log entry for October 9th reads, "Ground trembled at 2 a.m. Air thick as dust, though skies clear. Saw 2 lights fade into ridge. Smelled rain, but felt none." That note was the final government record attached to the name Clanton. The archive box labeled for the family was sealed the following month, its wax broken only once in 1937, when a historian opened it to find nothing but dirt. By 1919, Arizona had stepped into modernity, railroads, telegraphs, and new towns rising across the desert. Yet even as progress spread, the old names clung to the dry corners like burrs that refused to be shaken loose. The Dragoon ground, still unclaimed and unbuilt, remained a strange absence on the maps, an expanse labeled simply as Survey Incomplete. The first formal state investigator to reopen the file was Inspector Gerald H. Keene, newly appointed to the Department of Territorial Records. Keene was known for his skepticism. He believed the Clanton saga a blend of folklore and clerical error. His correspondence with the Tombstone Sheriff's Office makes his attitude clear. "We are chasing ghosts through ink and superstition. The Clantons died in blood, not mystery. The rest is desert talk." Still, Keene traveled to Wilcox in March 1920, armed with old survey charts and a box of fragmentary evidence, photographs, copies of Mercer's notes, and Cobble's last sketch. He spent 2 weeks in the field, sending short telegrams back to Phoenix. The messages began routine, reporting geological anomalies and compass issues, but on the night of March 17th, he wired a final cryptic note: "Located well, site active, soil disturbed recently." Witness lights as described, ceasing work at once. Keene never filed his written report. His tent was discovered the next morning intact, his instruments arranged neatly beside his cot. His boots were missing. The sand around the campsite bore deep impressions, as if something had pressed upward from beneath. The state archived his disappearance under natural causes lost in desert, though his telegram remained on file. It was the last government reference to the Clanton ground for nearly 2 decades. Locals revived the old phrase, the dragoon curse, muttering it whenever cattle wandered off or storms came early. A miner named Luca, Parnell claimed to have seen a man standing near the collapsed well one night, dressed wrong for the times, he said, in dust-caked trousers and a coat too thick for desert heat. When Parnell called out, the man tipped his hat and stepped backward into the hole, vanishing without a sound. That account reached the Arizona Daily Star briefly, printed under the headline, "Ghostly Figure Frightens Miners," before being retracted at the request of county officials. The editor later admitted the story stirred up too much of what should have stayed buried. Through all of this, the gunfight at the OK Corral remained the clean, public face of the Clanton legend, the kind historians could cite safely. But those who lived near Dragoon knew better. They said that what happened in Tombstone was only half the story, the loud half. The rest was the silence that followed, the kind that seeps into the ground and waits for someone foolish enough to listen. By 1921, the Dragoon property was fenced off, officially condemned for erosion hazard. No further entry was permitted. Yet now and then, freight drivers swore they saw lanterns swaying along the ridge during storms, as though the desert itself refused to forget its unfinished debts. And so the record closed again, quietly, politely, as all unsolved matters eventually do in the Old West. By the early 1920s, Arizona's scholars had begun to rediscover the darker margins of their own frontier history. The universities were growing. The old gunfighters were dying off. A new generation of historians, hungry for legend and credibility alike, looked again to the stories their grandparents refused to tell. Among the earliest of these was Professor Howard Fenley, whose 1923 lecture series, After the Smoke, The Private History of Tombstone, referenced the gunfight at the OK Corral not as an ending, but as a beginning. Fenley claimed to have read portions of Dr. Mercer's lost manuscript, the one destroyed in the 1903 fire. His surviving lecture notes describe a systematic pattern of concealment across 3 counties, linked by recurring marks of an inverted horseshoe and the alias E. Brand. Fenley's analysis was clinical, but he admitted a strange detail. Every attempt to visit the Dragoon site had failed. Compasses misaligned, wagons stalled, and maps blurred with dust, even indoors. In 1924, the Arizona Review of History published Fenley's essay, The Clanton Debt. It drew both praise and discomfort. One reviewer wrote, "Fenley writes of ghosts as if he expects them to answer." He did, sort of. A year later, in private correspondence with a colleague in New Mexico, Fenley mentioned receiving a parcel of unmarked soil wrapped in oilcloth, same odor Mercer described. He claimed it arrived with no return address and bore faint fingerprints that seemed burnt into the cloth rather than pressed. Fenley fell ill soon after and never finished his planned follow-up. His papers, boxed by the university, contained only fragments, photocopies of Cobble's 1909 map, a hand-drawn sketch of twin lights labeled The Lanterns, and one unnerving line in the margin. If the Clantons are buried, then the ground itself keeps watch. Meanwhile, a small circle of folkless aurists revived interest in the Clanton myth for public audiences. Their pamphlets mixed confession with curiosity, tales of cursed ground, of the earth whispering beneath boots, of lost riders followed by dim blue light. Yet even they treated the story carefully. In every telling, the Dragoon property remained unnamed, as if the land still demanded its secrecy. In 1926, a field expedition led by Dr. Malcolm Vire, a geologist unaffiliated with the university, claimed to have found traces of collapsed tunnels consistent with man-made digging. He refused to publish his findings, but admitted privately to a journalist that the soil samples contained unusual iron residue, as though something once burned long and cold beneath. When asked if he believed the old tales, Vire paused and said, "I believe the ground remembers weight." By 1927, most scholars had turned back to safer subjects. Fenley died that same year. Vire left the territory. Their notes ended up in a single archive box, mislabeled Miss Frontier Lore. It sat untouched for decades. Still, among locals, the Clanton story never entirely faded. Old cowhands muttered that during monsoon season, when the clouds pressed low and thunder rolled without lightning, you could see twin glows wandering near the ridge, slow, deliberate, and patient as debt collectors. By 1928, the legend of the Clantons had drifted somewhere between folklore and reluctant history. The academic world wanted to treat it as an allegory for post-war disillusionment, an easy metaphor for a violent age fading into modern order. Yet the few who had actually handled the surviving evidence disagreed. They said the story resisted symbolism, it refused to end neatly. At the University of Arizona, historian Professor Elsie Harland undertook the most ambitious effort yet to catalog every surviving reference to the Clanton case. Her 1929 monograph, Echoes Beneath the Frontier, opened with the line, "In the archives of the Old West, the space between what was written and what was erased often tells more than the ink itself." Harlan compared testimonies, land deeds, and lost correspondences, noticing peculiar consistencies, phrases repeated across decades, like echoes passed down through different hands. "The debt isn't done" appeared in both a deputy's report from 1887 and a stolen letter from 1907. The handwriting varied, but the slant of the script was identical. Her research also uncovered a connection long overlooked. The gunfight at the OK Corral, she wrote, served not as a conclusion, but as an eruption, a wound that never healed, spreading quietly through the Dragoon Hills. Harlan believed the surviving Clantons, if indeed they lived beyond Tombstone, had turned to a form of isolation that bordered on ritual, burying not merely their dead, but their guilt. In a lecture delivered in Phoenix, she addressed the lingering superstition with measured calm. History often mistakes persistence for haunting. What refuses to fade may not be spirit, but consequence. Still, Harlan could not explain the tangible anomalies that threaded through every generation of inquiry, the missing documents, the unmarked parcels, the vanished researchers. Her footnote is betray a growing unease. In one she writes, "There is a pattern to the disappearances, as though the story maintains itself by removing its observers." In 1930, a graduate student working under her, Eldon Pierce, returned from a short research trip to the Dragoon area and presented a small envelope of photographs, grainy shots of the ridge taken at night. Two faint glows appeared on the horizon in each frame, consistent in distance and height. Harlan dismissed them as lens artifacts until Pierce disappeared the following week. His camera was later found in a dry wash, the glass plates intact, but clouded with moisture, as if exposed to rain that never fell. Harlan never published another paper. She retired the following year, citing exhaustion. Her final note in the university files reads, "The desert does not keep secrets, it buries them alive." By then, even the skeptics had grown quiet. The Clanton name, once shorthand for lawlessness, now carried a subtler menace, less about gunfire, more about endurance. What remains certain is this: the history of the Old West ended on paper, but not in the earth. And for those who still walk the Dragoon trails at night, the silence seemed thicker than air, as though something unseen waited for its story to be finished by someone else's hand. By the early 1930s, the Dragoon land was officially forgotten, absorbed into private holdings, mislabeled in survey charts, and eventually fenced off by a railway company that never laid track. Yet travelers who passed near the ridge swore the air grew colder there, the horses uneasy, the compasses indecisive. Nothing grew, nothing stayed. The Clanton name had by then faded into textbooks as a footnote beside the gunfight at the OK Corral, a story of bullets and justice, of men who fought and fell and were buried by time. But beyond the neat lines of history, in the still and silent stretch between Wilcox and Tombstone, the old story refused to die. A retired lawman named Abner Holt, writing in 1932, claimed that while escorting a survey crew through the Dragoon Basin, he came upon what he called a field of small depressions, like graves that exhaled dust. Holt's letter, now in private collection, includes one sentence scratched faintly at the bottom. "You can hear the shovels if you stand still long enough." The following year, Holt's son visited the same site and found no trace of those hollows, only a flat expanse of packed soil, smoother than the surrounding ground, as if leveled by invisible hands. Around that time, a folklore magazine out of Denver printed an anonymous submission titled "Debt of the Clantons." It was written in the tone of a confession, signed only with the initials E.B. The author spoke of a pact made under desert rain, a promise that no man of our blood would rest until the ground was level again. The piece ended with the line, "Some names are not to be cleared, only covered." Few believed it, yet the story found quiet purchase in those who read between the margins of frontier history. Professors quoted Holland, archivists cited Mercer, and preachers in nearby towns still warned their parishioners not to wander too far east after sun's down. By 1934, the last documented visitor to the Dragoon ground, a highway inspector named Leon Firth, filed an unremarkable report on erosion, except for one closing sentence that seemed out of place in a civil record. "Saw light below ridge at 10:02 p.m., faint blue. Sound of chain and wind. Area stable." That was the final notation ever attached to the property. The site was struck from state records the next year, the file replaced with a generic stamp reading "Survey Void." And yet those who know the territory, the herders, the prospectors, the descendants of old families, still say the same thing when storms gather above the Dragoon Hills. The rain falls heavier there, the thunder lower, and sometimes, between the flashes, two lights move across the ridge, as if still searching for a place to rest. Some say it's trick lightning. Others swear it's the last of the Clantons keeping their vigil, bound to the debt the desert never forgot. But perhaps it's simpler than that. Perhaps the land itself, scarred by the weight of history, still turns quietly in its sleep, remembering. And so the record ends, unsolved, unclosed, still breathing beneath the dust of the Old West.